The wind had a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks in the wood. An old habit of the mountains, Graham Ellis had long stopped fighting. Outside, the snow fell in silent flurries, soft and steady, blanketing the pines that stretched like ancient sentinels along the ridgeline. The light was fading fast, but in Haven Ridge, it always did this time of year. Winter didn't just visit, it settled in. Graham pulled his coat tighter around him and locked the cabin door behind him, the wooden latch clicking with a familiar weight. His boots crunched across the snow-dusted porch as he paused to look out over the vast stretch of white that framed his home. No other houses in sight, just trees, wind, and silence. And somehow, that had always been enough. The peaks in the distance were shrouded in mist, their jagged edges softened by snow. He stood there a moment longer, watching the last sliver of sunlight disappear behind the hills. In the stillness, all he could hear was the distant groan of the wind curling down the mountainside. From inside, a voice drifted out, light, off-key, and entirely out of place against the hush of the storm. Nora. She was humming again, likely wrapped in a blanket near the fireplace with her crayons and construction paper scattered all around her. Graham felt the corner of his mouth tug upward. That small sound, that single stubborn thread of music, was the reason he kept going. He stepped back into the warmth of the cabin, snow clinging to the edges of his coat. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering light across the old wood-paneled walls. The cabin was worn, lived in, and patched together over the years with quiet determination, much like Graham himself. Nora didn't look up when he entered. She was too focused on the yellow sun she was scribbling onto a corner of her drawing, tongue peeking out in concentration. 8 years old, hair wild with soft curls, and eyes too big for a world that had already taken her mother away. "Hey, Bug," he said softly, brushing snow off his sleeves. "Hi, Daddy," she replied without glancing up. "Did Mr. Ray need help today?" He shook his head. "Too cold. He's staying in." "Oh," she said, the disappointment barely touching her tone. "I was going to show him my picture." "Well, I'll bet I'd like it even better," Graham offered, crouching beside her. She turned the page toward him, beaming. A crooked little house under a white-topped mountain, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. One of them had curly hair, one had stubble on his chin, and the last, floating near the sun, had wings. "That's you, me, and Mommy," she explained, tapping each figure. "We're all outside together. Even though Mommy's not here, she still watches us." Something caught in Graham's throat. He placed a hand gently on her back, letting the warmth of her small frame ground him. "It's beautiful, Nora," he whispered. That night, as always, was quiet. Graham fixed a loose pipe beneath the sink while Nora read aloud from her storybook, pausing to ask what big words meant. After she'd fallen asleep, curled up tight with her stuffed bunny, thumb tucked close to her mouth, Graham lingered at her doorway, watching, listening to her steady breath. He moved back into the kitchen, poured himself a weak cup of coffee, and stared out the frosted window at the road that wound up into the hills. Snow swirled beneath the porch light, thick and fast now, the kind of snowfall that buried things. And that's when he saw them. 2 flickering headlights, dim and hesitant, crawling down the mountain road like they weren't sure where they belonged. A gut instinct tightened in his chest. He set his mug down, reached for his coat again, and stepped back into the storm. The snow came heavier now, thick flakes swirling like ash from an unseen fire. Graham jogged down the steps, boots sinking with each stride, the wind cutting across his cheeks as he moved toward the edge of the road. The headlights grew brighter, then dimmed again, swaying uncertainly as the vehicle struggled to stay between the lines that had long disappeared beneath the storm. He raised a hand, waving cautiously. The SUV crawled to a stop just short of the ditch, tires spinning once before catching. The driver's window rolled down slowly. Inside, a woman sat hunched over the wheel, eyes wide behind the blur of snowflakes clinging to the glass. She looked out of place in every way. Flawless makeup, hair curled and pinned despite the weather, and a sleek coat that was clearly made for city sidewalks, not mountain wind. "You all right?" Graham called, voice raised over the howl of the wind. "I think I took a wrong turn," the woman replied, her voice trembling but calm. "I was trying to get off the mountain before it got worse, but I can't see anything now." He glanced at the way her tires had already begun to sink into the slush. No way she'd make it down. Not tonight. "You're not going anywhere in this," he said, stepping closer. "Best you come inside. Wait it out." The woman hesitated, her gaze shifting past him toward the small cabin, barely visible through the snow. He could see the flicker of calculation in her eyes. She was clearly weighing every danger. The isolation, the stranger offering shelter, the unknown of it all. "I've got a little one inside," Graham added, lifting his hands. "Just me and my daughter. We've got heat, food. You're welcome to ride out the storm with us." That seemed to shift something. Her expression softened, just slightly. "Okay," she said at last. "Just for the night." Graham helped her out of the car, grabbed a flashlight from his coat pocket, and led her through the snow. Her boots weren't made for this terrain, and she stumbled more than once, catching herself with stiff, gloved hands. By the time they reached the porch, her cheeks were flushed red from cold, her hair dusted with flakes. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. She paused near the door, blinking as if adjusting to the sudden quiet. The fire crackled. The cabin smelled of cedar and coffee and something faintly sweet. Maybe apple-scented soap. "Let me take your coat," Graham offered. She hesitated, then slipped it off, revealing a fitted cream sweater and tailored slacks that looked far too clean for any snowstorm. Graham hung the coat by the door and stepped aside. "I'm Graham," he said simply, extending a hand. She took it, fingers delicate in his rough palm. Claire. Claire Marston. The name didn't mean anything to him, just another traveler caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. From the hallway, soft footsteps padded toward them. Nora appeared, hair tousled, eyes blinking sleepily. "Daddy," she murmured. Graham crouched beside her. "Everything's all right, Bug. This is Miss Claire. She got stuck in the storm. She'll be staying with us tonight." Nora tilted her head, studying Claire with the quiet seriousness only a child could manage. "Do you like coloring?" she asked bluntly. Claire blinked, startled. Then a small smile curved her lips. "I suppose I do." "That's good," Nora declared, turning to go. "You can sit by the fire. It's warmer there." Claire glanced at Graham as if asking permission. He just nodded. She crossed to the hearth, her movements careful, still unsure of how much space she was allowed to take up. Graham poured a fresh cup of coffee, handed it to her without a word, and returned to his chair. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the popping of firewood and the low whistle of wind against the windows. But Graham didn't rush to fill the space. Years of solitude had taught him that sometimes quiet said more than questions ever could. After a while, Claire spoke, her voice low. "You've lived here long?" "All my life," he answered. "This cabin's been in my family for 3 generations." She nodded, staring into the flames. "It's peaceful." Graham studied her in the flickering light, the sharp cheekbones, the tired eyes. Not the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too long, too far. "You're not from around here," he said, not accusing, just stating fact. Claire let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "No, I'm passing through, I guess." Nora reappeared then, wrapped in a blanket, her thumb halfway to her mouth before she caught herself. She walked over and leaned into her father's side. Claire watched them quietly, and for the first time since she arrived, her posture softened. Just a little. Like maybe, just maybe, this place might hold something worth staying for. The cabin had a way of settling into its own kind of silence after sundown, a soft, living stillness that wasn't quite empty, but reverent. The kind of quiet where every creak of wood and flicker of flame felt like a whisper instead of a sound. Claire sat in the armchair by the fire, her coffee cooled long ago, hands still wrapped around the mug like she needed something solid to hold on to. Across from her, Graham sipped his own slowly, eyes half-lidded, but alert. They hadn't spoken in several minutes. It didn't feel awkward. It felt real. "Do you always keep things this quiet?" Claire asked eventually, her voice no louder than the crackle of the logs. Graham glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "Noise doesn't change much out here. You learn to let stillness speak." Claire nodded, eyes falling to the fire again. "I'm not used to quiet. There's always something back home. Meetings, emails, voices I don't always want to hear." Graham didn't ask what she was running from. He didn't have to. Some people ran from chaos, others from silence. Either way, they ended up in places like this. After a pause, he stood and gestured toward the hallway. "You can take Nora's room for the night. She'll bunk with me." But before Claire could respond, Nora peeked her head around the corner. She had a blanket draped over her shoulder, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly in one hand. "Can she sleep in my room?" Nora asked, looking directly at Claire. "Just for tonight?" Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't mind," Nora said earnestly. "I've got 2 pillows, and I can share my blanket." Claire looked at Graham, unsure. He nodded once. "If you're okay with it." She hesitated, then offered Nora a gentle smile. "All right, just for tonight." Nora beamed and disappeared into the room, already dragging the extra quilt off her bed. Claire followed a step behind, passing Graham in the hallway. He gave her a quiet glance, one she couldn't quite read, but something about it made her chest feel oddly lighter. Inside the small bedroom, Claire noticed the details she'd missed earlier. The hand-drawn pictures taped to the wall, the nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, the scent of lavender and crayons. Nora had already climbed into bed and was patting the space beside her. "Here," she said. "This side's warm." Claire chuckled softly and eased onto the mattress. It dipped beneath her weight, the quilt cool against her legs. "Do you always invite strangers into your bed?" Claire teased lightly. Nora shrugged, matter of fact. "Only the ones Daddy lets inside." Claire stared at her for a moment, touched by the child's certainty, by the unfiltered trust in her words. She switched off the lamp beside the bed, letting the glow of the nightlight bathe the room in soft blue. They lay there in the hush, back to back at first. Then, without warning, Claire felt Nora shift. A tiny arm reached across her waist. The little girl's forehead pressed against her shoulder, warm and gentle. Claire froze, just for a moment. It had been so long since someone touched her like that without agenda. No reason, no tension, just pure, small affection. Her breath hitched, eyes wide in the dark. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, her lips curved. A smile, not one she planned, not the kind she gave in boardrooms or in photographs, but something soft and real, something she hadn't felt in years. She closed her eyes, her hand resting lightly over Nora's. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside that small room, something shifted, quiet and invisible, like a seed pressed into soil beneath the snow. The next morning came gray and slow, the world still wrapped in winter's hush. Graham had already stoked the fire and put on coffee when he heard the soft pad of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Claire emerging from the hallway, wearing one of his old flannel shirts over her clothes and rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her hair was slightly tousled, and there was a peace in her face he hadn't seen the night before. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she echoed, voice softer than before. "She sleep all right?" he asked, nodding toward the hallway. Claire smiled, this time awake and aware of it. "She held on to me like she's known me forever." Graham poured her a mug of coffee and slid it across the table without a word. Claire wrapped her hands around it, glancing out the window at the snow-covered road, then back at him. I didn't realize how much I missed this, she murmured. What? Graham asked. She paused. Being wanted without needing to prove anything first. Graham didn't say anything, but he met her eyes, and she knew he understood. From the hallway, a sleepy voice called out, "Miss Claire!" Claire turned, the smile already finding its way back. "Be right there, honey." And just like that, the stillness of the cabin no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like the beginning of something. Claire sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that smelled faintly of cinnamon and something darker, maybe roasted beans and pine smoke. The warmth seeped into her palms, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself simply sit. No phone, no laptop, no pressure. Just the sound of firewood crackling and Graham's quiet movements near the stove. Nora skipped into the room a moment later, barefoot and still wearing her polka dot pajamas, her curls wild with sleep. "Morning, Daddy," she yawned, climbing onto the bench beside Claire without hesitation. "Morning, Miss Claire." Claire smiled gently, brushing a loose curl from the girl's forehead. "Good morning, Nora." The child grinned, reaching across the table to grab a crayon and the half-finished drawing from last night. "I'm going to add you in now," she said. Claire blinked. "Me? You weren't in the picture before," Nora explained as if that much was obvious. "But now you're here." Graham glanced over from the stove, one brow raised but eyes warm. Claire chuckled, watching as Nora carefully drew another stick figure beside the others. She gave it long hair, a yellow scarf, and then added a sun in the corner that smiled a little wider than the last. "She's got talent," Claire murmured, still watching. Graham poured oatmeal into 2 bowls and set them on the table. "She's got heart," he said quietly. Claire looked up at him then, really looked. The soft lines of his face, the steadiness in his hands, the way his presence felt less like conversation and more like shelter. She took the offered bowl with a murmured "thank you," and for a while they ate in companionable silence. After breakfast, Nora bundled into her snow jacket with practiced speed, hopping from foot to foot as she tried to tug on a boot. "Can I show Miss Claire the barn?" she asked, turning hopeful eyes toward Graham. "There's still snow up to your knees out there," he said, sipping his coffee. "Maybe tomorrow if it melts a little." Claire leaned forward. "I don't mind the snow," she offered, "if it's okay with you." Graham studied her for a second. She didn't say it like someone trying to be polite. She meant it. He gave a short nod. "Stay close to the path." Nora cheered, already pulling Claire by the hand toward the door. Claire laughed softly, grabbing the scarf Graham wordlessly held out. Their fingers brushed for a moment, just barely. But it was enough to send a pulse of awareness through her chest. The world outside was blinding white, the snow packed but clean, glittering under the pale morning sun. The cold bit at her cheeks, but Claire didn't complain. There was something crisp about it, honest. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. The barn stood a little ways off, sagging slightly under the weight of years and weather, but still solid. Nora bounded ahead, her boots crunching through the drifts. Inside, the air was cooler, but still and quiet. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wood, casting long lines across the floorboards. Nora darted to a corner, pointing up. "Sometimes birds come in here. See? They make nests where it's dry." Claire followed her gaze, spotting a small bundle of twigs tucked into a rafter. "It's like a little secret hideout," Claire said softly. Nora nodded. "Daddy says even broken things can still be useful." Claire's eyes lingered on the girl, then wandered to the beams above them, the scars in the wood, the tools that hung unused on rusted nails. She pressed her palm lightly against one of the old wooden posts, letting the rough grain scratch her skin. "This place has a lot of character," she murmured. Behind her, Graham's voice replied, "That's one word for it." She turned, surprised to see him in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes squinting slightly against the light. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. "I figured you'd want to see it," he added. "It's been part of our family longer than the cabin. Claire smiled, letting her gaze sweep across the worn boards and forgotten corners. I like it, she said. It feels honest. Graham didn't answer, but his expression shifted slightly, something unreadable softening around the edges. As they walked back toward the house, Nora between them, Claire couldn't help but glance sideways at him. The wind was still cold, the path still slippery, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was running anymore. She felt like she was being led home. Later that afternoon, the cabin had settled into a kind of peaceful rhythm. Nora was curled up at the kitchen table again, humming softly as she colored, her boots drying by the hearth. Graham had gone out to check on the generator, leaving Claire alone inside for the first time since her arrival. She wandered through the small space, trailing her fingers lightly along the edges of the furniture, well-worn but cared for. Everything in this place had a story. She could feel it in the scuffs on the floorboards, the faint scent of old pine, the photographs tucked just out of sight. Drawn to the corner of the counter, Claire began straightening a stack of papers left near the bread box. Graham's handwriting was scrawled across envelopes and scraps of wood-stained receipts. She wasn't snooping, just tidying, she told herself. But then something caught her eye. Half tucked beneath a utility bill was a folded piece of paper, heavier stock, slightly more polished than the others. She slid it free almost absent-mindedly until her eyes locked on the logo in the top corner. Her breath stopped. It was faint but unmistakable. The soft silver embossing of Marston Holdings, her family's company. Claire's fingers tightened on the edge of the page as she unfolded it. It was an invoice, one of thousands that crossed her desk back when she still showed up to the office. She scanned it quickly. Heating system repair, emergency winter upgrade, past due. The name at the bottom, Ellis, Graham. A sharp wave of something, shame, guilt, disbelief, rose in her chest. Graham had no idea who she was. Or maybe he did, and he never said anything. But no, she would have seen it in his eyes. There was no recognition, no guarded edge, just quiet trust. The same kind he'd shown her from the moment she stepped out of that snow-covered car. She looked around the cabin again, but everything suddenly felt different, like she was intruding, pretending, living inside a lie she didn't mean to build. Claire folded the paper and set it back exactly where she found it, her hands trembling slightly. She walked to the window, heart pounding, the snow-covered yard outside no longer peaceful but distant. How many people like Graham had received invoices from her family's empire? How many had to choose between heat and food? And here she was, sleeping in his daughter's bed, drinking his coffee, holding his child in her arms at night, while a debt with her name on it quietly loomed over his head. She barely noticed when the door opened behind her. "Hey," Graham said, stamping snow off his boots. "Generator's holding. We'll be fine if the power flickers again tonight." Claire turned, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's good." He tilted his head slightly. "You all right?" She hesitated. A dozen lies formed at the tip of her tongue, but they all tasted wrong. "I'm fine," she said finally, voice soft. "Just thinking." Graham didn't push. He simply nodded and moved to hang his coat. That night, dinner was quiet. Nora was her usual bubbly self, showing off her new drawing, now featuring the barn, the birds, and Claire in a bright yellow scarf standing beside them all. But Claire couldn't focus. Her laughter was slower, her words measured. Every kind gesture Graham offered, passing her the salt, refilling her glass, tucking an extra quilt by her chair, felt suddenly weightier. She excused herself early, claiming she was tired. Graham offered her a nod, maybe sensing more than she let on. Inside Nora's room, the little girl had already laid out her stuffed bunny on Claire's side of the bed. "I made space for you," Nora whispered sleepily. Claire smiled gently and slipped under the blanket. This time she didn't hesitate when Nora curled into her side. But even with the warmth of the child beside her, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts louder than any storm. She had come here to disappear, to escape. But what she'd found wasn't an escape. It was a man who fixed things with his bare hands. A little girl who trusted without hesitation. A life built not with money, but with care. And now she had to ask herself the one question she had been avoiding for years. What would happen if they knew the truth about who she really was? That night she tried to sleep beside Nora, but rest wouldn't come. Her mind spun with questions, doubts, what-ifs. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the subtle creaks of the old house breathing around her. Eventually she gave up. Slipping from beneath the blanket, Claire tiptoed through the hallway in her socks. She poured herself a glass of water, the cold seeping into her fingers. The only light came from the fireplace, still glowing with soft embers in the main room. And that's when she saw him. Graham was sitting in the armchair, his elbows resting on his knees, hands folded loosely. His eyes weren't on the fire. They were somewhere far off, somewhere quiet and unreachable. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment, not sure whether to step forward or turn back. But something in the slope of his shoulders, in the silence that surrounded him, pulled her closer. He didn't look up when she approached, but he knew she was there. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "Me neither," he replied, his voice low, calm. Claire sat down on the edge of the hearth, the warmth of the fire brushing her legs. "I found something earlier," she said, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "An invoice. From your last heating repair." Graham said nothing, only shifted slightly, his eyes finally moving to her. "It had my family's logo on it," she continued. "Marston Holdings. My family owns it. I used to run the division that handles rural accounts like this." She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't come here to lie. I didn't expect to stay. And once I did, it got harder to say anything." Graham leaned back in the chair, the firelight casting shadows across his jaw. "So you're the one behind all those fancy contracts and company policies?" he asked. Not cold, just curious. Claire offered a small, self-conscious smile. "Guilty." Silence again. She braced herself for judgment, for the distance to grow even wider. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Even. I don't care about that." Claire blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "What?" "I don't care where you came from, what your name's tied to, what you're running from." He looked at her now, really looked. "I only care about who you are when you're here." Claire felt her breath catch. "You didn't have to help me fix Della's porch," he continued. "You didn't have to cook breakfast with Nora or crawl through snow to see an old barn or listen to a little girl talk about birds and stars and people she misses." He leaned forward slightly. "That wasn't some corporation. That was you." Claire looked away, her eyes stinging with something sharp and vulnerable. "I didn't want it to be a lie," she whispered. "It's not," he said simply. They sat there in silence, the fire crackling between them. And slowly something in her began to ease. Not completely, not all at once, but just enough. She looked back at him. "I was scared you'd see me differently." He shook his head. "I see you clearer now." Her eyes shimmered, but her smile was real, quiet, unguarded. In the stillness of that late hour, beneath the weight of truth finally spoken, something fragile but strong began to grow between them. Not built on pretenses or perfect timing, but on presence, on showing up, and staying. The morning after their quiet conversation by the fire, something between them had changed. Not in some grand, sweeping way, but in the smaller details. The way Graham poured her coffee without asking how she took it. The way Claire lingered at the table longer than usual. The way their silences no longer felt heavy, but full. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Later that day, Graham grabbed his coat and reached for his tool belt. "I'm heading up to the old schoolhouse," he said. "Roof's starting to sag near the bell tower. Won't survive another storm. Claire looked up from where she sat helping Nora with her drawing. You're fixing it alone? I've been trying to keep it from falling apart the last few years, but no one really uses it anymore. That doesn't mean it should be left to rot, she said, a little sharper than intended. Graham raised an eyebrow, amused. Claire stood. I want to help. He tilted his head, skeptical. You sure? Not exactly boardroom work. She smirked. Well, I figured it's time I start building something real. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, half sunken in snow, its white siding chipped and worn. Claire stared at it with a mix of nostalgia and sorrow, like looking at a forgotten photograph. Graham unlocked the old front door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, dust danced in shafts of winter light spilling through broken windows. Desks were stacked against the walls and chalk still clung to a cracked blackboard. Place used to be full of kids, he murmured, his voice low, before families started leaving. Claire walked slowly to the center of the room, letting her fingers trail over the old wood. We can bring it back, she said, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. Graham looked at her. Not just with money, she added, with hands, with heart. He studied her face, saw the quiet fire behind her eyes. All right, he said, let's start. Over the next few days, Claire returned to the schoolhouse every morning, boots laced, gloves on, hair tied back. She scraped, painted, lifted beams, and hammered with clumsy but determined hands. She watched, learned, and did everything Graham showed her. Word got around town faster than either of them expected. By the third day, Della showed up with a pot of soup and a sharp smile. Figured you two could use fuel. Then came Ira with extra nails and stories about how he'd sat in this same building 50 years ago. Teenagers offered to carry scrap wood. Mothers brought warm muffins and extra mittens. Old men wandered in just to sit and talk about the past. The schoolhouse became more than a building. It became a symbol, a heartbeat, and Claire, once a stranger in expensive boots, was suddenly part of something. One afternoon, Graham found her outside, sanding a splintered window frame. You've been out here since dawn, he said. Claire wiped her brow with her sleeve, cheeks flushed from cold and effort. I forgot what it felt like to actually make something with my hands. You're good at it, he said simply. She looked at him, surprised. I thought you didn't think I could handle real work. I didn't say that, he replied. I said most people wouldn't try. But you did. Claire's smile was slow but sure, and for a long moment they just stood there in the cold, the air between them clearer than the sky above. That evening, as the town gathered at the schoolhouse to celebrate the progress, lanterns flickered along the path and laughter echoed in the crisp night. Nora tugged at Claire's sleeve, holding up a new drawing. It was of the schoolhouse, painted fresh, lights glowing in every window. Beside it, 3 stick figures stood hand in hand. One had Graham's beard, one had Nora's curls, and the third had Claire's yellow scarf and a heart drawn right over her chest. I added you, Nora said simply. You belong here now. Claire knelt down, eyes misting. Thank you, sweetheart. Nora tilted her head. Do you think maybe one day I could call you Mom? Claire froze, a lump rising in her throat. Her eyes met Graham's and something quiet passed between them. She reached out, gently brushing a curl from Nora's face. I'd be honored. From behind, Graham placed a hand on Claire's back. Not a gesture of possession, but of something steadier, something permanent. And as music played softly in the background and neighbors shared warm drinks and stories beneath the winter sky, Claire realized something she hadn't dared believe before. She wasn't passing through anymore. She had arrived. The following week, the snow still lingered on rooftops and fields, but something in the air had shifted. It was subtle, like a breath released after being held too long, like the slow melt before the thaw. Word had spread quickly. The schoolhouse would reopen come spring, And to mark the effort, the town decided on a celebration. Nothing grand, just something to bring people together. Della called it a festival of lanterns, a nod to the light they'd all brought back into Havenridge, piece by piece. Claire had never planned a festival before, not one without planners and budgets and a PR team. But this was different. This was real. She helped hang paper lanterns across Main Street, stringing them between telephone poles and tree branches, her fingers red from the cold, her scarf tied tight. Graham worked beside her, hammering wooden stakes into the ground for food tables and warm drink stands. Nora darted between them, arms full of hand-painted lanterns she'd made herself. "That one's for Mama," she whispered, holding up one with a golden sun. "So she can see us." Claire's throat tightened, but she smiled and nodded. She'd love it. As dusk crept over the mountains, the lanterns flickered to life. First one, then another, until the streets shimmered with soft amber light. People gathered slowly at first, bundled in scarves and coats, holding steaming mugs of cider and hot cocoa. Then came laughter, music, footsteps crunching in the snow. The schoolhouse glowed from within, windows warm and bright, its old bones alive again. Claire stood near the entrance, watching it all unfold. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life, yet every lantern, every face that passed, every smile directed her way reminded her. This was hers too now. She felt a tug at her hand. Nora. The little girl's cheeks were pink from the cold, her curls bouncing under her knitted hat. "Come with me," she said. Claire let herself be pulled toward the center of the street, where children were gathering with small lanterns, each one cupped between gloved hands. "Daddy said we could make a wish," Nora whispered, holding her lantern close. "Then we let it go." Claire crouched beside her. "What are you wishing for?" Nora looked up with those wide, steady eyes. "For you to stay." Claire's chest swelled with quiet joy, tender, unexpected, and full. She kissed Nora's forehead. "That's my wish, too." The music faded for a moment as the crowd hushed. Graham stepped forward, standing beneath the largest lantern that hung over the schoolhouse doors. He didn't say much, just a simple thank you to everyone who showed up, who held on, who helped rebuild not just a place, but a spirit. Then one by one, the lanterns were released into the air. Nora's was first. It rose slowly, dancing gently against the dark sky, the golden sun she'd drawn glowing from within. Claire watched it drift upward, her hand instinctively finding Graham's. He didn't let go. She turned to him, her voice just above a whisper. "How did this happen?" He glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You stayed." Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment, everything else faded. The company, the past, the guilt. Only this remained. A man with weathered hands who looked at her like she was enough. A little girl who had chosen her long before she'd chosen herself. In a town that had opened its doors without needing explanations. As the last of the lanterns disappeared into the night sky, Claire felt a small tug again. Nora standing beside them, looking up. "Miss Claire," she said softly. Claire bent down. "Yes, sweetheart." Nora hesitated, then reached out and took both her hands. "Can I call you Mom?" The words fell into the space between them like snow. Gentle, silent, perfect. Claire didn't answer with words. She just knelt, wrapped her arms around Nora, and held her tight. When she finally pulled back, her voice trembled. "I would love that." Behind them, Graham said nothing. But when Claire stood, his eyes were glassy, and he reached for her hand again. No fanfare, no speeches. Just belonging. Just love. That night, long after the music quieted and the lights dimmed, Graham, Claire, and Nora walked home together. Their boots left 3 sets of tracks in the snow, side by side. On the porch, Claire paused, looking back at the distant glow of the schoolhouse lanterns, still flickering like stars fallen low. "I never thought I'd find this," she murmured. Graham slipped an arm around her. "Find what?" She turned to him, smiling. "A place that felt like it wanted me to stay." He kissed her temple, his voice low. "Funny thing is, we were waiting for you all along." The morning after the Lantern Festival arrived with a hush of golden light and quiet footsteps. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind a soft, glistening blanket across Haven Ridge. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel new again. Claire stood at the kitchen window, a mug of tea in her hands, watching Nora build a crooked snowman in the yard. The little girl was bundled in her oversized coat, talking to herself as she worked, occasionally glancing toward the cabin to make sure someone was watching. Claire smiled, tapping the window in reassurance. Behind her, Graham moved through the room with a rhythm that had grown familiar, checking the fire, placing a folded blanket over the back of the chair she always sat in, rinsing the mugs without needing to ask if she was finished. It was domestic, quiet, and so deeply comforting that Claire almost didn't notice how her heart had changed. When she did, it wasn't with surprise, but with a kind of peace, like she'd finally come home to a place she hadn't realized she'd been looking for. She waited until later that afternoon, when the sun had begun to dip low and golden through the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. Nora was inside, curled on the rug with a book, humming to herself. Claire found Graham out near the barn, stacking the last of the firewood. His sleeves were rolled and his breath came in slow clouds, but he worked without complaint, as always. She approached quietly, her boots crunching in the snow. "Hey," she called softly. He turned, brushing his gloves together. "You all right?" "Yeah," she said, though her voice trembled ever so slightly. "There's something I've been thinking about." Graham straightened, the faintest smile touching his lips. "That sounds serious." She stepped closer, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her coat. "It is." There was a pause, long enough for the wind to sigh through the pines, for a crow to call in the distance. Claire reached into her pocket and pulled something out. It wasn't a ring, not in the traditional sense. Just a small folded square of paper, one of Nora's drawings with 3 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. She held it out to him. He took it, brows furrowing. Claire inhaled deeply, the cold air sharp in her lungs. "I never imagined I'd find something like this. You, Nora, this place. And I never imagined I'd want to stop running long enough to keep it." She paused, eyes steady on his. "But I do. I want this. Every quiet morning, every snowy walk, every bedtime story and leaky pipe and lantern-filled night." Graham didn't move, but his expression softened. Claire smiled, nervous and sure at once. "I know it's not traditional. I know I didn't come here with a plan, but if it's all right with you." She pulled a simple silver band from her pocket, a ring that had once been hers, worn but meaningful. "I'd really like to marry you." There was a silence so full it felt like time paused to listen. Graham blinked, the hint of a laugh in his throat, but it never made it out. He just looked at her, eyes warm and steady. "You're asking me?" he said quietly, almost teasing. She nodded. "I'm not great at waiting around." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers closing over hers, anchoring her. "I didn't think I'd ever have space in my life for something like this again," he said, voice low. "But you showed up, Claire, and you didn't just stay. You made this life better." He looked down at the drawing, then back at her. "So yes," he said. "Absolutely yes." Relief and joy flooded her chest all at once. She laughed, blinking quickly to chase away the tears already rising. Behind them, the cabin door creaked open, and Nora's voice rang out across the yard. "Did you ask him?" Claire turned, eyes wide. "How did you—" "I saw the ring in your coat yesterday," Nora grinned, running toward them, breath puffing in the cold. "Does this mean we're really a family now?" Claire knelt, arms wide. Nora threw herself into them, wrapping around her like she always had, as if she'd been hers all along. Graham joined them, pulling both into his arms. The three of them stood in the snow, wrapped in something deeper than warmth, something rooted, chosen, earned. And in that quiet, snow-covered yard behind the old barn, without dresses or suits or fancy music, the promise was made. Not someday, not maybe, but now, together. Spring arrived in Haven Ridge, not with fanfare, but with quiet conviction. The snow melted slowly, retreating from porches and roofs, revealing damp earth and green shoots brave enough to stretch toward the light. The river, once silent under ice, began to murmur again, winding through the hills like a song returning to memory. Claire stood in front of the schoolhouse, now fully restored, her hands lightly brushing the fabric of a simple ivory dress. Borrowed from Della, slightly altered, a perfect fit in its imperfection. She had pinned a small flower in her hair, Nora's doing, and wore the silver band Graham had returned to her the day after she proposed, now etched inside with one word: stay. The whole town had shown up. Della bustled around the tables with trays of hand-baked pies and bouquets made of wildflowers. Ira brought folding chairs and a speaker that only played old country music. The children, Nora among them, wore flower crowns and carried tiny lanterns in place of petals. There were no tuxedos, no aisle runners, no orchestra, just people, laughter, the scent of pine, and love. Claire stepped through the open schoolhouse doors, her breath catching at the sight before her. Graham standing near the front, in a dark shirt and suspenders, his beard neatly trimmed, eyes locked on her like she was the only person in the world. And next to him, standing proudly, clutching a small bouquet she had made herself, was Nora. The little girl beamed when she saw Claire. "You look like a real bride," she whispered as Claire reached them. Claire knelt, her voice trembling. "And you look like the best flower girl anyone's ever had." Nora's face lit up. "Not just flower girl anymore," she said quietly. "I'm family now, remember?" Claire blinked fast, her smile shaky but true. "That's right." She kissed Nora's forehead before rising, turning toward Graham, her breath catching again. "You sure about this?" she teased softly. Graham reached for her hands. "I was sure the moment you offered to hammer nails in the snow." Chuckles rippled through the small crowd. They didn't have an officiant, just Della standing under a wooden arch wrapped in ivy, holding a hand-sewn notebook filled with scribbled vows and crooked hearts drawn by Nora. "You two need someone to make it official?" Della had said that morning, grinning. "I've signed enough checks in this town. Might as well sign off on a marriage." The ceremony was short. Claire spoke first, her voice steady, words wrapped in simplicity. "I didn't come here looking for love," she said, eyes on Graham. "I came here because I was tired, lost. But you gave me room to be more than what I'd been. You saw me, the real me, and you stayed." She took a breath. "And now I choose to stay too. With you, with Nora, with this life we're building." Graham's reply was quiet but sure. "I never thought I'd feel whole again, not after losing so much. But you didn't fill a gap. You built something new beside me, stronger, truer. You didn't ask for a place here. You earned it." He looked at Nora. "And I thank whatever power brought you to that storm, because it gave my daughter a mother she adores, and gave me a partner I never dared hope for." Della wiped her eyes, then cleared her throat. "Well," she sniffed, "if that don't count as vows, I don't know what does." The crowd laughed, clapped, cheered. "By the power vested in me by sheer gumption," Della declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Go on, kiss her!" Graham didn't wait. He pulled Claire close and kissed her like the world had narrowed to just that one moment, warm and sure and entirely theirs. Nora squealed and threw her arms around both of them. "I told you this would happen," she beamed. The rest of the evening was a blur of celebration. Children ran through the field. Neighbors toasted under lantern light. Someone brought out a guitar. Claire and Graham danced barefoot in the grass, while Nora spun in circles nearby, her laughter rising like wind through the pines. And when the stars emerged, clear and scattered across the dark blue sky, Claire leaned her head on Graham's shoulder and whispered, "We did it." He kissed her hair and murmured back, "We're just getting started." As the music played on and the lanterns flickered above, their hands remained entwined, calloused and soft, worn and new. It wasn't a perfect love. It was better. It was real. The sun rose gently over Haven Ridge, casting soft golden light across the hills, warming the earth that only weeks ago had still been buried in snow. The schoolhouse stood quiet in the distance, windows catching the morning glow like sleepy eyes blinking open to a new day. On the porch of the Ellis cabin, 3 mugs of steaming cocoa sat on the old wooden table. Claire wrapped both hands around hers, savoring the quiet warmth that came not just from the drink, but from the stillness around her. Graham sat beside her, one arm stretched along the back of her chair, his other hand nursing his own cup. Nora lay stretched on the porch swing, blanket around her shoulders, gently humming to herself as she stared up at the morning sky. Everything felt settled, not finished, not perfect, but settled. Claire looked over at Graham, catching him in that rare, unguarded moment. Eyes soft, lines around them relaxed. "I used to think forever was a fairy tale," she murmured. He turned toward her. "And now?" She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Now I think it's just a bunch of quiet mornings strung together. This, right here." He didn't reply. He just kissed the top of her head, like it was an answer. Nora sat up suddenly, stretching like a cat. "Can we go to the schoolhouse later? I want to hang up my new drawing in the library." Claire laughed gently. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll all go." The little girl grinned and curled back into her blanket, content. The porch creaked as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant earth. A new season had begun, quietly and without fanfare. But for the family sitting on that porch, coffee in hand, hearts full, no need for running, it felt like the first day of forever. And it was.